a renewal of the Unicef conceptual framework of malnutrition causality in Africa's drylands, and has, I should say, has a particular focus on the Sahelian and East African countries. As a nutritionist with many years' experience, I have to say I'm a huge fan of the Unicef framework, and I can clearly remember strongly advocating to Oxfam in the early 90s that they should adopt it, given the way it distills the complex multi-causality of malnutrition and distinguishes the immediate, underlying and basic causes. And this is something that is readily understood by everyone and clearly showed what was within our influence as an NGO at that time and what was not. So in this sense was empowering and also a bit of a relief. And this shows you the link to the actual brief. So moving on, next slide, please. So in taking a fresh look at the framework, we took a two-step strategy. We proposed a re-emphasis and reiteration or update of all that is great about the framework, the concepts, the organization of ideas, and the operational approaches. And for this reason, we have remained true to large parts of the original. And as you will see here, the immediate and underlying causes reflect this original 1990 version published in the UNICEF strategy document, Nutrition for the 90s. Next slide, please. Step. That's fine, thank you. The second step was to identify and explain those elements that we felt were either poorly understood or missing from the more recent adaptations of the framework. In particular, this drew attention to the basic, more systemic drivers of acute malnutrition that we felt were particularly relevant in drylands, while also considering the mechanisms and pathways through which these basic and systemic causes are driving the underlying causes of acute malnutrition. And in brief, these include, at the bottom of the framework or base of the framework, environment and seasonality, as people's lives and livelihoods are shaped by seasonality and the extreme rainfall variability and seasonally high temperatures that are characteristic of drylands, and in the context of climate change are an increasing challenge. Now, the impact of climate and environment is, of course, mediated at the level of systems and institutions. For example, on their own, natural hazards or climate shocks do not cause disasters. They can only trigger them. So the impact of shocks are essentially mediated by the wider systems of governance and related economic, food and health systems. Next, we incorporate the role of livelihood systems, which in turn drive the three clusters of underlying causes. Note also that we explicitly refer to the resilience and adaptation of livelihood systems in order to benefit from the parallel learning in this field. Next slide, please. Why now are we suggesting the need to review this framework? The reasons from our side at Tufts was that this work builds on a wider range of earlier work, and also what we sense more broadly is an increasing awareness and concern regarding the problem of acute malnutrition and its prevention. So I'd like to mention 3 points in particular that justify this work now. First, the challenges of persistent global acute malnutrition, where rates of acute malnutrition exceeding emergency levels are found to persist year in, year out in some areas, in both protracted emergencies and also occurring in non-emergency years or more stable contexts. Linked to this is the seemingly intractable nature of acute malnutrition. It is increasingly clear that technical solutions in isolation are not enough to sustainably reduce acute malnutrition. Point relates to what we have called gaps in the framework. And I just want to mention here our 2018 review of persistent global acute malnutrition, where 4 cross-cutting themes emerged from our interviews, which were either not explicit or clearly expressed in the UNICEF framework, that were felt by experts and practitioners to be central in the understanding of the drivers of persistent global acute malnutrition. And those themes at that time, 2018, were around gender, livelihoods, the history and experience of vulnerability and long-term trends driving acute malnutrition, and also seasonality in acute malnutrition and its drivers. Now, some of these gaps are obviously well covered in parallel theories and concepts, including, for example, the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework and the vast field of work on reducing vulnerability, building resilience. I just want to check in here to see if you can all hear me.
Oh, yes.
Great, let me continue. The third point relates to the importance of understanding malnutrition in the particular context of drylands. We've come to the recognition that most of our work on nutrition, livelihoods, and resilience for the past 2 or 3 days, or at least a lot of it, has been in drylands in protracted crises and often conflict-affected regions. In fact, if we look at where most of the donor money is spent, drylands account for a very large part. For example, according to US aid, over the last decade, international donors have spent roughly $90 billion in just 9 countries with large dryland areas, accounting for almost 50% of all humanitarian assistance in the world. So next slide, please. I also just wanted to briefly mention that regarding the importance of understanding malnutrition in dryland contexts, this was also brought home to us in some of our most recent work on nutrition, livelihoods and resilience. And particularly some recent work that we've done on what we call our Twin Peaks study, which looked at the relationship between the seasonality of acute malnutrition with environmental factors, including rainfall, temperature and vegetation, as well as conflict and emergency events and local livelihoods. So this work was supported by FAO, and it has provided us with important lessons regarding the interconnectivity between nutritional outcomes and their basic causes in Chad, Sudan, and South Sudan. I'll say more about the findings from this study later. But for now, I would like to turn to our first panelist, Dominique Burgeon, and ask, what makes dryland contexts unique, and what is it about them that we need to understand? Thank you, Dominique. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And I should say we are very happy to have the opportunity to participate in this webinar, as the issue of indeed the drylands has gained huge importance as part of FAO's resilience agenda, to the point that when it comes to Africa, we have one the resilience initiative that is clearly focused on building resilience in the drylands of Africa. In that respect, I think it's important to keep in mind that Africa drylands are a unique and complex environment where over recent decades, crises have become more and more frequent and protracted. As a matter of fact, a World Bank report that was published in 2016 noted that the drylands are being home to about 50% of Africa population, including a disproportionate share of the poor. As you all know very well, the dryland extend from west to east and north to south, but in the particular context of this webinar, we will predominantly focus on the drylands of West and East Africa. Local populations in the drylands of Africa rely predominantly on agriculture-based livelihoods, pastoralism and settled farming systems co-evolved to adapt to the harsh environment. These systems are particularly resilient, but what we have to say is that over the last few years, they've been steadily eroded due to the greater frequency of a variety of shocks that has affected them. Since the drylands are facing a number of overlapping challenges, First, of course, the climate variability, the climate variability being more pronounced, with climate change contributing to higher temperature, and recent evidence in the Darfur region of the Sudan showing long-term reduction in annual rainfall, for example. Rains are indeed becoming less predictable in terms of starting dates, quantity and distribution, of course, severely affecting crop and fodder production, as well as water availability for herds. While dryland farmers have historically had longer-term outlooks of 2 to 3 years, now we are witnessing a situation where they don't have such an outlook, and often we see a bad year coming after another bad year. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, the SILS, which is the interstate authority for drought in the Sahel, has issued its project report, which is the forecast for the coming season. That was indeed showing that while we had 2 years ago a bad indeed pastoral lean season, and that was to which they barely recovered last year, now again they are again about to face another pastoral lean season crisis. So it shows that it's becoming more and more frequent and more intense. Second, broader socioeconomic change across the continent and in the dryland themselves, huge repercussion for local communities. For example, weak governance, long-standing marginalization of some communities, especially pastoralists, insecure access to natural resources have particularly impacted on women and youth. Livelihood diversification is also spread. Pastoralists have moved into farming, and farmers raising livestock. There has been an increase in trade of natural resources and in ad hoc manual labor. This agricultural expansion and intensification of land use for different purposes has increased competition, especially in herder-farmer corridors, led to degradation of pastures and loss of fertility of cultivable land, and has implications for child labor and women's workload, and potentially contributes to conflict as the former symbiotic relationship between livelihood group is undermined. Is unfortunately also becoming a reality in the region, from local level violence between different livelihood groups or intertribal fighting to the national and cross-border conflict. Violence is definitely driving food insecurity, bringing people access to agricultural land, market, water resource, as well as basic services like education and health. We all know that in 2019, the Lake Chad crisis, the Lake Chad Basin regional conflict, which began in 2014, entered its sixth year. As a result, population across Africa's dryland are experiencing persistent level of acute food insecurity. You may know that FAO, together with partners, including WFP, Unicef, IGAD, SILS, OCHA, and many others, has released in April this year its third global report on food crisis, showing that globally there were 113 million people in what we call IPC 3 and above, which means acute food insecurity. It's important to realize in that context that about more than 1/3 of these 113 million people live in the drylands of Africa that are on the agenda of today's meeting. So it shows that really the prevalence of acute food insecurity, the type of food insecurity that can potentially, is very much increasing and is very much prevalent in this region. What I think is also important to note in that context, and despite the numbers that you have mentioned, Hélène, in terms of the volume of humanitarian and assistance that is going to this region, is that when it comes to targeting, there are frequently some of the most vulnerable people, and especially the pastoralist and livestock dependent communities, a tendency to be forgotten when it comes to that sort of humanitarian assistance, which therefore increase the vulnerability and can lead in some instances to some of these communities abandoning their main source of livelihood. So these are a few points, and I would be pleased to contribute to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a very bleak and serious picture of a combination of worsening problems affecting people's lives and livelihoods. Without wasting time, I'd like to turn to Lauren and ask about the challenges of preventing malnutrition in these contexts. In particular, I wanted to mention, Lauren, a wasting policy brief from 2014 that I read that acknowledged the lack of effective approaches to address acute malnutrition. And just to find out more about your position on that, but also it would be helpful to hear about WFP's approaches.
Thank you, Helen. I hope that you can hear me. Thanks to the Feinstein International Center for sponsoring the webinar, and thanks so much for including me on the panel. I'm going to jump right in. I just want to say, first and foremost, that I also am a huge fan of the Unicef framework, and I really appreciated the concept paper on the dry lands, because I really feel that it's absolutely critical to take a look at the overlay of the dry lands of Africa, and as they have just been defined, and the drivers for acute malnutrition. The World Food Program have been involved in treating and preventing acute malnutrition in just such contexts as Dominique has outlined in his previous presentation, particularly in the wake of crisis and where conflict and climate change either changes food systems or quite frankly destroys them. And we've been doing this for about the past decade. Beyond the humanitarian emergencies that make the news, I think you are very right to focus on the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, where we also see a profound impact. Unfortunately, prevention has not always been the name of the game. Often treatment of acute malnutrition has been the go-to for dealing with children affected by acute malnutrition. As most of you know, this involves finding the children who are already quite malnourished and providing them primarily a fortified or specialized nutritious product in a facility or a community center when the child is already malnourished. Clearly, from the UNICEF framework and from the Lancet series of 2013, we know the drivers of malnutrition, and I think that we know there are much better ways to do this. At WFP, we've been working hard, stressing that we need to make sure that a lot fewer children ever see the inside of a treatment facility by doing much more to prevent acute malnutrition. I want to be clear, though, that the treatment of acute, moderate and severe acute malnutrition is critical. A child that has acute malnutrition needs treatment. If we're not analyzing all the drivers, the causes of that child being malnourished, particularly in these dry land environments, there is a really good chance that we will see a relapse occurrence with the same child or in the same family. We could reduce the number of kids that reach MAM, and we could make sure that even fewer reach that state of severe acute malnutrition through prevention measures. And I don't need to tell this audience that, of course, that's absolutely necessary, because acute malnutrition have about a 12% or greater potential for mortality. Demonstrates that we should link and co-locate both nutrition sensitive and nutrition specific or the treatment together. Nutrition sensitive measures are the more preventive ones that help to build the resilience and enhances the chances of success, but it's not easy. It's the continuum of care that underpins effective actions to address acute malnutrition. So just to be clear what I mean by that, we're talking about using multiple platforms within a country to give us many bites at the apple, if you will, so to speak. This means that we're not only talking about providing treatment in a care facility, but making sure that kids go to our well-fed school feeding program, to make sure a food for acids program helps to establish household gardens or irrigation systems, and that a social protection program thinks about the special nutrition needs of adolescent girls, pregnant and lactating women, and that it's all well sequenced, based a lot on seasonality, and co-located community, a district, or a department. So the idea is to make sure that all of the interventions think about nutrition in their design, in their implementation, and sort of create a nutrition web of support that helps to combat acute malnutrition at many levels and addressing many members of the family. And so this more preventive approach, we believe, is critically important, particularly, say, in the Sahel, but it's a bit contradictory to the traditional rhetoric that we should only address acute malnutrition of the most vulnerable. We're saying that to make a clear dent in reducing acute malnutrition, we need to target across the life cycle, use a more integrated approach, improve outcomes that takes into account everything from gender and livelihoods and climate change. I'm not suggesting this is easy, particularly because in the dry lands, we're suggesting that we do it in some of the most difficult contexts in the world. Two last points. Although linking and co-locating prevention and treatment of acute malnutrition makes strong intuitive sense, there's not a lot of evidence yet. And that a nutrition sensitive approach is the right one. We need to continue through our work to develop that evidence base. The final point is yet a critical one. We need strong analysis. We have a tool in WFP we call Fill the Nutrient Gap that has been instrumental in guiding many governments as well as the offices and our partners on key policy and program drivers, primarily on the dietary intake side of the Unicef framework, but the drivers of acute malnutrition. And we believe that this solid analysis can provide the platform for effective action. So the take-home points are three: break down the silos. We need a continuum of care across treatment, particularly in the dry lands. Effectiveness is grounded in prevention, and a strong analysis of the drivers of malnutrition is essential. Thank you very much.
Ellen, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. I was talking to myself. Anyway, Lauren, thank you. Very good to hear your emphasis on the importance of prevention and the ideas about the platforms and the web of relevant support. And of course, we welcome the idea that, breaking down traditional sectoral silos can perhaps be assisted by evidence-based approaches and deeper analysis. Anyway, talking of deeper analysis, let me now turn to our third panelist, Bjorn Ljungqvist. Bjorn, the UNICEF framework has been with us now for more than 30 years. I really wanted to ask you about what accounts for its longevity, what are its strengths, and do we need to be refocusing on these? Thank you, and over to you, Bjorn.
Me? Okay, wonderful. Thanks for the question and for the opportunity to participate. I'll be happy to talk about the UNICEF Nutrition Causality Framework at length, but in the interest of time and for the purpose of this discussion, I will focus on three key points. My first point, and the simple answer to your question, is that during the last 30 plus years, the UNICEF framework has continued to show its usefulness in a wide range of applications and locations around the world. And as you will see, I actually believe that your excellent analysis of the drivers of the nutrition problems in the African dryland areas is further proof of this. The original version of the framework, as adopted by the UNICEF Executive Board in 1990, you can find in slide 1, and it's already been referred to by Helen in her introductions. However, what has happened increasingly is that we have seen a gradual shift and a focus on the topmost part of the causality change, what we call the manifestations and the immediate causes of malnutrition. This shift in emphasis has been particularly strong after the publication of the Lancet Nutrition series in 2008 and 2013. The Lancet series adopted the UNICEF framework, but used it in a rather specific way, namely for defining the concept of nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive interventions, and for identifying a minimum package of 11 to 13 proven and effective essential nutrition actions. These actions all belong to the category of nutrition-specific interventions, as you see in slide 2. A related shift that took place in the Lancet series application is the omission of the important principle of the AAA cycle as a strategic process by which assessment and analysis is meant carried out incrementally over time and to be applied and tested in specific contexts. You see the AAA cycle in the next slide here. This omission means that the framework takes on a more static and tactical character, losing its sensitivity to issues of time, such as seasonality and trends, and to specific features of local situations, and to major development shocks and events. The emphasis on nutrition-specific interventions and omission of a AAA approach has arguably had some strong advantages in establishing operational simplicity, consistency in key messages, and attention to visible results, as demonstrated within the global scaling up nutrition movement. At the same time, however, eliminating the process for localizing and promoting internalization of the framework limits the scope to address malnutrition in society as a fundamentally complex problem. Complex meaning that it is unpredictable and interconnected, which requires close follow-up and capacity for flexible adjustments. It also means that we are paying less attention, as Lauren already said, to prevention of the problem. And as we have seen in the African dryland areas, we continue to use large resources of emergency aid for treating acute malnutrition with little improvements year on year, as the basic condition that produce these problems remain the same. The second point is that since the adoption of the UNICEF Nutrition Strategy of 1990, there have indeed been continuing steps to further develop and improve the structure, the logic, and applicability of the approach. And I include 3 examples here, progressive improvement or development in slides 4, 5, and 6. And you will see that our aim increasingly focused on linking the nutrition causality framework more closely to the emerging theory and methodology human rights-based approach to programming. As you also see, we try to explain the original emphasis on resources, human, organization, and financial, more comprehensive understanding of the capabilities for realizing human rights to nutrition security, where resources are still critical, but needs to be considered together with the critical factors of responsibility, accountability, and authority, which is coming out clearly on the last slide. In such a fully human rights-based approach to nutrition programming, you simply follow up your analysis of causes and drivers of malnutrition in a given situation with a role and analysis, where you use these causes to identify the patterns of duty bearers who are apparently not fulfilling their duties and claim holders apparently not able to claim their rights to nutrition security. Having identified these acts, as we sometimes call it, formal and non-formal institutions, you can then assess the capacity gaps and design your policies, programs, and actions accordingly. Unfortunately, my lifelong, I would say, and Urban Johnson, who led this work in the past, he left us a few years ago. but we are quite a number of persons who continue to view this human rights-based approach and methodology as the most appropriate way to pursue nutrition policy and program work. And as I explained, it is firmly based and developed from the original AAA cycle and causality framework. That leads me to my third and final point concerning the nutrition situation in dryland areas and the efforts of the Tufts Group to address these problems. The Tufts Group claims that the Unicef analysis is inherently limited in not recognizing at the level of basic causes such issues as seasonality, gender, and local livelihoods and resilience. I would simply note that all these aspects, in my view, are clearly included in the original causality framework and have always been highlighted in the AAA approach wherever I have applied or observed it. In fact, brings back the original approach, which has been largely lost and downplayed in the Lancet version. The proposed changes to causality framework in the Tufts concept note, which Helen summarized, are, in my view, a welcome return to the original framework and to include some useful enhancements of labeling selected key factors. In other aspects, however, I think the proposed vision represent a limitation of the original concepts, and I'll be able to elaborate on this point if time allows. I think I stopped there, Helen, but I'm really excited over this opportunity to come back to a serious discussion.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. I really appreciate your reflections and particularly your highlighting some of the experience with the recent developments of the framework by various developments and the risks the potential risks in tinkering with the original and the risks of losing some of its original strengths as we adapt it. I also really welcome the opportunity for discussion, as this is the way that we can really move things forward. And at this point, actually, I think I'd like to just pause and check in with the audience to see if there are any questions. Please do use the chat box. We can take some now, or if you'd like to share an experience, go ahead. I will just make one comment on what you've said, Bjorn, and that relates to the temporal dimension of the framework. I know that embedded in it is the approach, which encapsulates a kind of real-time process of learning and review. But I think there is something longer from the perspective of historical trends and also the seasonality question. And this is something that Suzanne Jaspers and I worked on in the 80s and 90s. And while we both drew inspiration from the UNICEF framework, it was actually combined with additional learning on famine, vulnerability, and livelihoods, which was not evident from using the original framework in isolation. So I think we need to somehow acknowledge the wealth of related work and what has been done that we need to learn from, that we risk ignoring because of the silos, the questionable assumptions or blind spots, or also perhaps because sometimes we only think about what we are bringing and not what we can learn from others. Now let me just come back to the questions. Question here. While the vulnerability and causal pathways significantly overlap between wasting and stunting, the drylands in East Africa seem to be relatively better when it comes to stunting. Ooh, what explains that? Any new research in these areas? Thank you very much to Waldy Daniel for that question. I think it's a tough one to answer briefly, and I might suggest we hold it until we come to our Q&A session and see if we've got any takers on the panel for that question. For now, I think I'd like to move on to our next speaker and turn to our panelist, Luka Kuol, and particularly ask you about institutions, which were referred to in the original framework, but these have not been elaborated upon in relation to drivers of acute malnutrition particularly. And I wanted to hear from you why institutions are so important and how we elaborate on them or explain them so that nutritionists and others can appreciate their role and importance both as a cause of malnutrition and also as part of the solution. Over to you, Luka. Thank you.
Helen, first, thank you very much for organizing this timely engagement about this important framework. As Grace said, I'm really fond of this framework, and I really congratulate UNICEF for such a work. Second, I would like also to congratulate you, Helen, because the process is more important than the product. I think as we are going to develop the framework, the fact that you have managed to involve different stakeholders, it will actually enrich the product by the end of the day. A coalition of people with a certain interest in how best we can make sure this framework is operationalized and becoming a practical tools that can be able to help us. But I want to highlight also the issue of the drylands, as mentioned by Dominique. I think for us in Africa Center, we are using the mega train of security challenges by 2030. And the idea is that what should we do now in terms of institutional arrangement and in terms of policies if these megatrends, security megatrends, are going to unfold by 2030, and what we should do now. And in fact, the drylands and the Horn of Africa, these are manifestation of some of these megatrends are interacting. And it is good that you have chosen the dryland and then the East and the East Africa. And I want to link this one to the issues of the SDG 16, because SDG 16 is so important. It's about the institutions and peace building. And so I just want to highlight the importance of the framework. The other one that I like, and it is good that you managed to bring back the issues of institutions to the debate of the framework. And I think the 1990 rightly put the formal and informal institutions. And the most important thing is not only the shocks and how the shocks are mediated, and you rightly put it, and mediated through these systems, these institutions. What is very additional is the system. It is the political economy approach. And for me, political economy, it is unpacked really the actors and how the governance structure are actually to mediate in terms to manage these shocks. I will use my personal experience when I engaged in the 1998 Sudan famine in order to anchor the debate around the institutions and why institutions matter and the system, which is the additional one. I think I saw the institutions in the way they responded to the famine and malnutrition in South Sudan. And from that lens, I would like to share some of the few points. The most important point I want to say, as we are reviewing the drivers of malnutrition, I think we are likely to focus more on the demographic changes and then the change. But I think the most important challenge for me, it is the issues of governance. The malnutrition is a manifestation of governance deficit. And I think it is very important for us not to shy away from this core cause of the malnutrition, bad governance. 1998 famine of Sudan was a clear case of governance deficit, the denial of access and the diversion of food aid by the rebels. And it is very important to see it is a famine that could have been averted if we were to have the right institutions, the right governance during that time. But equally important, what we are seeing also in the drylands and also in the Horn of Africa, beside these shocks, it is a clear case of a decay and regression in the democracy. And this pattern of regression in democratic space in the dryland and the Horn of Africa, if it persists, we are going to see an increased case of the malnutrition and even famine. And I think you echo some of these issues, why this region is so vulnerable. It is because of the system, the quality of governance that we are seeing. The second point linked to the bad governance is the quality of institutions, whether it is formal or informal. And it is good, I want to highlight the importance of the framework of 1990 of bringing the informal institutions to the debate. And I hope this framework, although we have put them together, but I think it's very important to highlight the critical role played by definitely I just want to highlight the fact that the bridging role of these institutions, I mean, it's very important. And I think I don't want to highlight more about the Why Nations Fail, the book Why Nations Fail. Unequivocal answer is institutions, institution. But not only in the institutions, it must be the exclusive institutions that tend to be the one actually accentuating the vulnerability in some of these areas. And my personal experience is that the role of institutions, we need to look at them, whether national, local, because sometimes we tend to look at the national level, but let's focus on the local level. In most cases, we focus on formal rather than informal institutions. And for me, even these informal institutions, I call them anti-fragile institutions. These are the institutions that tend to be resilient during the shocks, and we tend not to focus on what we have, especially the traditional institutions. And I just let me to highlight some of the few points about the importance of institutions in terms of analysis, in terms of advocacy, in terms of intervention, in terms of targeting of aid. So one of the good things during the famine of 1998 was the definition, what is famine? And we took a hell of time in order to agree what is famine. But all the agencies, they agreed about the malnutrition indicators. And that's a very positive one. But even though we look at the classification of whether it is level of famine, I think it is very important to highlight to see what can we do to have a common understanding around the malnutrition indicators so that we can be able to have a good classification of the vulnerability in terms of famine. And I think I need to emphasize the work of Stephen Devereaux and Paul Howe, whereby they used the famine of 1998 in order to develop their scale. We need to stress also the importance point made by Dan Maxwell about the persistence of confusion about indicators that we can use to measure malnutrition or famine. I hope this framework will be able to help the institutions to have a common understanding of the drivers as well as the methods of measuring the scale of vulnerability. The second point is about definition of who is vulnerable, whose vulnerability. I think the idea of having the external institutions coming in to address malnutrition or to address famine, it needs to be handled in such a way that the role is complementing institutions. Otherwise, we'll be killing the existing institutions and that local social safety nets. I saw an example of how the targeting of food aid in a way undermine the existing institutions. And that's why, for example, in my studies, I found how the affected communities were setting up their own famine courts in order to address the vulnerable people during the year. So I think this idea of the responsibility is the affected communities. They have a very anti-fragile system that we can be building on. The role of international actors is to complement what is existing. And I think that's is a big challenge. Yes, affected, but this is affected, but I think we need to. So the whole lot of whose responsibility it is very important that we will shape the debate about the way we engage in such a situation. Now, let me, beside these traditional institutions, some of the institutions are sometimes not being emphasized so much, especially the markets. And markets like traditional institutions are quite important, even in the middle of conflict. Markets that tend to function. And actually, our intervention, and it is an institution that I believe it could play a very important role. My last point, it is how can we anchor our analysis with this framework to the local level, at the community level. This is where you have immense resources unrecognized, hidden, but that's so huge in terms of understanding the vulnerability and the way we can respond. I just want to conclude. The most important thing from this framework is telling us the importance of having innovative ways of how we should be able to have a very comprehensive institutional system analysis at all levels, but particularly at the community level. Let me stop here, Helen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luka. Very helpful indeed to hear these personal insights. And I especially liked your emphasis, find it particularly helpful on the governance deficit and the role and importance of institutions. Also the last point about needing to leave room for innovation, and especially innovation at the local community level. I think we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to move straight on to our fifth panelist, Gwenaelle. Gwenaelle, I particularly wanted to ask you about timeframes, which, as I said earlier, the Unicef framework does not always consider. ACF has a particular strong experience working in the Sahel and other dryland contexts. I wanted to ask, from your experience, how this features, how seasonality affects the way you work, and whether or not you think we know enough. Over to you, Gwen.
Thank you, Helen. So yes, ICF works with the community and use tools like seasonal calendars to better explore community perception on the driver of undernutrition and how they vary over time. In the Sahel, community identify different seasons linked to different drivers of undernutrition. For example, mothers explain that their children are most vulnerable to diarrhea at the onset of the rainy season because of the dirty water. They also identify vulnerability of their children during the lean season, just before the yearly harvest, when food stores become scarce. Lastly, mothers explain that it is difficult to abide breastfeeding practicing recommendation during the period of agricultural work when the workload is high. You know that immediate drivers of nutrition are subject to seasonal changes and strains over time. And we take this into account in our activities. However, we grasp how seasonality affects the whole pathway leading to undernutrition, as we don't know enough about seasonality and trends over time of basic and systemic drivers. So nutrition sensitive activity focus mainly on the immediate and underlying drivers of undernutrition than basic and systemic causes. Mostly because it's linked to the temporality and the scope of donor funding, which compromise the sustainability of our action. This focus on the immediate and underlying causes gives us the impression that we already know the problem, that the problem is the same everywhere. For example, that undernutrition is almost everywhere linked to poor hygiene practices, to food insecurity, to poor IYCF practices. And we therefore assume that we have sufficient knowledge to design multi-sectoral interventions. But it's more complicated than that. We must contextualize our response to specific problem. The best way to address undernutrition is to provide a tailor-made solution. It's quite contradictory to the injunction to scale up and roll out a cookie-cutter solution to replicate from one region to the other or from one country to the other. Indeed, the definition of local is really relative and often presupposes that there is a community homogeneities. And there is this tendency to believe that the communities within the same region or same area are similar to one to another. So, and then we overlook local specificities and vulnerabilities, and that limits our impact. So within observe an impressive heterogeneity within agropastoral communities, who goes way beyond the agro versus pastoral distinction. Despite the acculturation of community who are living in the same area for decades, there are still major differences in terms of how community access to land and water, in terms of their seasonal mobilities, in terms of the access and uses of milk, in terms of the crops diversity, and even how women have access to resources. Those differences will lead to different vulnerability and exposure to different seasonal pathways to undernutrition. Today, we are aware that of the limited of this one-size-fits-all multi-sectorial program. Seasonality or contextual specificity linked with basic driver are not enough taken into account, and this might lead to missed opportunity for high impact programming. One example kind of missed opportunity, we can take the example in Chad of the suboptimal uses of borehole, who suffer from the poor understanding of seasonal mobilities of the community in Sahel, but also of the understanding of conflict linked to competition over natural resources between groups linked to climate variability. So we think that we need to reinforce our tool and M&E assessment with promoting longitudinal mixed method and contextual formative research to bring out specificities and advocate for tailor-made answer. Designing integrated, dynamic, multi-sectorial programs are still challenging, and there is a necessity to base our intervention on the involvement of community and on a rigorous analysis of expressed or induced needs by the community. To then we could construct our program from the point of view of the communities who obviously do not think in silo.
Thanks very much, Gwen. Good to hear about your experience, and also you highlighting some important trends and features of Drylands that many of us miss, such as the homogeneity between communities, or we presume it is, but obviously it's not, and our failures to recognise some of the key differences. I'm also pleased that you've actually mentioned methods and how we get a better understanding, and I wish we had more time to discuss all of this, because obviously that's really important. And just to say once again, I hear a clear call for involving the community in the diagnosis and design of responses. Now actually I want to pause just very briefly and share a key finding from our Twin Peaks study that relates to seasonality. Now this is important to us because it revealed that one of our most common assumptions is actually potentially flawed. Now these three graphs show the seasonal rates of malnutrition in 3 different regions, in Chad, Sudan and South Sudan. And along the bottom are the 12 months of the year. Now the curves show how the rate of acute malnutrition changes seasonally, with the highest peak in each country occurring around April to May. Now that is roughly at the end of the dry season and beginning of the rains. Now it's hard actually to put a month on this, because the start date of the rains in these countries can vary by up to 2 months or more. So seasons are not always consistent with particular months. But then I want you to note that the rate of malnutrition then falls as the rainy season progresses, only to rise again slightly just before the harvest, which might be thought of as the lean season or hunger gap. Of Twin Peaks challenges our conventional wisdom of when we tend to think acute malnutrition is worse, because it is widely assumed to be during the hunger gap or lean season. In our report, we argue that it's the seasonality of livelihood activities linked with environmental variability that's driving these changes, in food security, care and health factors, and consequently the rate of malnutrition. As Gwen pointed out, there are often critical localized factors that we often miss. So I would suggest that, you know, we do frequently have to reassess some of the broad generalizations that we take for granted. We're running a bit behind time. The question is actually around, actually, I'm going to move on and have one final question, which will be to one or two panelists on the question of engagement and participation. Part of the original vision of the Unicef framework was that the ownership of causal analysis based on the framework should be localized, in other words, community-based. Now, what I wanted to ask is, has this really filtered down to the local level? Do community health workers understand that malnutrition has multiple drivers? And how important is this? Could it be done better? And maybe if one or two of you could respond, perhaps or Gwen, it would be helpful to hear from you. Or others, just put up your hand. I see actually Dominique would like to respond. Can we go over to you, Dominique?
Hélène. Yes, I think to respond to your question, it's clear that local level ownership indeed depends first on real discussion and consent among actors, nutrition experts, UN agencies, regional bodies. For us, this means clearly engaging with local communities and local authorities and strengthening the capacities of local institutions. And this very much touch on what Luka and others were saying. And in that respect, I think it's particularly important in regard to natural resource management and conflict resolution, which as FAO we are trying to do in a number of countries. In that respect, I also could flag the importance of the work we do in the context of the Global Network Against Food Crisis, which is really a multi-partner network that aims at addressing these issues and the issue of food crisis at their root causes, and where we partner with with quite a number of key partners here. But I also take this opportunity to say that to re-emphasize the importance of livelihoods approach, and to really in this overall discussion to say yes. I mean, what it shows here is that health-based approach are indeed critical, but that livelihoods approach are equally important. And the number of studies that we have done, yes, with you, Tufts University on the Twin Peak, but also with Texas A&M on predictive livestock early warning system, where we see a link between malnutrition and deteriorating availability of fodder and therefore of milk. But also the work we are doing with the operational research that we are now conducting in Kenya with Washington State University, again is trying to really change this paradigm from a situation where we are basically addressing the consequence of to a paradigm where we try to prevent malnutrition to occur by working on the livelihood, which in many of these areas of the dryland depends on livestock, and where preventative action to the deterioration of the condition of livestock could immense impact in terms of malnutrition prevention. So I think this, from our perspective, this is a key message we would like to pass. I mean, there is a whole lot of actions that are now clearly identified on what can we do to prevent acute malnutrition to occur on the livelihood side, and it's especially when it comes to livestock. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominique. Any other panelists who'd like to speak to this particular issue?
Yes, can I come in?
Absolutely. Thank you,
Yeah,
Luka.
Helen, thank you very much. I just want to build what Dominique said, and I think I just want to share with you in terms of the analysis at the community level. My personal work with the issue of managing livelihoods provides me the centrality, the fact that the specificity and the variation within the context of the this dry land or the Horn of Africa. In monitoring and in setting up the livelihood monitoring system, I think we have a lot of good opportunities. For example, one of the things we use in South Sudan, we decided using collecting the formal livelihood indicators like market prices, like seasonality and all these things. We decided to look to some of indicators that are very specific to the communities. What are the things that communities believe that are linked to their livelihood? And I think we have been using those information in order to really to give the context based on the community knowledge. They have a certain thing that sometimes they may look like myths, they look like very strange, but I think building on those are very important. But what we have been doing is actually we have been collecting the data from the people, but we have not been able to sit down with them in order to analyze the data that we have been collecting. I think there's a lot of good room for the international actors to engage of how you can be able. I mean, there are a lot of work being the participatory approach has been done, but I think we talk in most cases, but we don't apply. So it's not only we don't want to look at the communities as the providers of information, but as the people knowledgeable and analyzing their conditions. And I think that attitude of change is not because in most cases we usually go and then collect the information and then we but even I think we may need to deepen the system analysis and institution analysis. Who is to do what and how people survive? Even if assuming that there is no any international community coming, which institutions are likely to be able to intervene in such at the community level? Because there are a lot of good, innovative, well-built social safety nets that are quite important for us to build on them. And I think, and for me, I think like what Dominica said, I think it's very important to zoom in at that level and possibility because you will see a lot of opportunities. Just let us put more focus on the at the community at the community level. Thanks.
Sorry, problem getting the mute off. Luka, thank you so much. These questions, I think, are really, really helpful. How do people survive? And the distinctions that you draw between communities or, providing us with information versus actually teaching us how they survive in these contexts. And I think that's where we can learn a lot from the parallel work that's being done on pastoralism that basically helps us to understand how people manage the extreme variability and how their livelihoods are actually adapted to these contexts. So very helpful indeed. Anybody else like to respond to this? Or next I will move to the open Q&A session where we can have some questions from our online listeners. Let me move to some of the online questions. Just want to highlight again, as you can see on your screen, the chat box where you can type your questions in. We have received a number, and I'm going to see if we can share these out between the different participants. And we have something specific here in relation to the SDGs. Our current understanding and use of the nutrition causality framework consistent with the needs to address malnutrition in the context of sustainable development and the SDGs. Would anyone like to take that? maybe we'll come back to that question since I don't think there are any hands up. I have another one here which actually builds on the earlier discussion. It is a fundamental issue, a gap in the conceptual framework, or the actual practice, particularly at community level interventions. I think Gwen, you're prepared to have a shot at this.
Yes. So yeah, I think we all agree that and recognize that the way forward is to put community at the center of humanitarian action. There is also a lot of challenge to really get community inside and involve them. Most of the time there is this bias as us as an NGO coming to the communities and trying to discuss. They will drive the discussion to discuss causes and solutions that affect immediate or underlying issues, because they will know that this is where they have the best chance to receive aid from NGOs or other agencies. So this is one struggle we have, that it's really difficult to have a deep understanding and go behind this the formal discourse they give us. And working with and implicating the community requires a specific skill set and know-how, and we don't have always the right human resources to work in that way.
Thank you, Gwen. Very helpful. We have another very specific question here about the room for maneuver with the UNICEF framework. Is there any possible room that the UNICEF framework can be updated and revised specifically around these basic causes, or a portion of it? And I just wanted to say, to tell listeners that we've been hearing this week from UNICEF about their updating of their 2020-2030 10-year nutrition strategy, as part of which the framework will be updated. And I get the impression that they're very open to considering how to take it forward. So I think we have an opportunity here to broaden the discussion and potentially influence UNICEF. Thank you. Pick another question. We have a question for you, Lauren, which is about, and maybe others might want to respond to this too, further elaborate on the frequent request we hear for further strong analysis of the drivers of malnutrition in the arid countries. Yes, any reflections on that from our participants? And I think, Gwen, this might give you a chance to say something more about methods, but first over to you, Lauren.
I think that, I think it's very simple. I think that we all agree that the very analysis needs to be done, and that if we don't get that analysis right, even if our community health workers and even our traditional players understand that there are multiple drivers of malnutrition, given the real complexity that we're seeing in some of these drylands areas with climate change and conflict, if we don't do the right analysis, we're going to come up with the wrong solution. So making sure that we allow, often in emergencies, we want to move in so fast and take action, but taking that time to do the analysis and to make sure that we've got that analysis right by bringing all stakeholders involved, making sure they're all involved, is going to be really critical for us to getting that right. It seems so simple, but it often doesn't happen, and we really need to make sure that it does.
Thank you very much, Lauren.
May I come in?
Yes, do come in, Luka.
Yeah, I just, Helen, I just want to link up for this question with the SDGs and this framework. I think what this framework is providing, and this is a very good question about the SDG related to the malnutrition, but even I want to highlight the SDG 16. The most important thing, and this is where we may need to do a bit of scenarios and analysis in terms of what will it take us, what are the things that we are going to see to change up to 2030? Because 2030 seems to be a target. And what is good with 2030, it is a period within which that you will be able to build the right institution, because building an institution takes a lot of time. It's not less than 10 to 15 years. So if we could make a scenario analysis about how, especially the dry land, by 2030, given the current situation, the trend, in terms of the mega trend, whether it is climate change, whether it is demographic change, migration, terrorism, whatever, and then to see what are going to be the implications of this, and what we need to do now in terms of the policy, in terms of the institutional development, and in terms of preparing ourselves for the actual intervention. And for me, for example, we're doing this thing in the Africa Center. We are saying, what is going to happen with these megatrends by 2030? What are the implications, the security implications for the security institution? What do we need to do now in terms of policy, in terms of the institution, in terms of the human resource that we need in the security sector in order to respond to this one? I think this framework is a good way of trying to look at the things we agree on the driver, and then to have this scenarios analysis, and then to start preparing ourselves. That is going to be a very important piece of analysis that can be helping us to use the framework as well as preparing ourselves for the 2030.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Luka. Excellent points. And I think brings in that notion of shared analysis. Coming back to that earlier question about, do we already know the drivers? I think we have an opportunity to promote the learning about the drivers together with a wide range of actors, and at the same time develop our understanding of institutions. I also wanted to just raise the point that in relation to the analysis is that often the focus of our analysis is the evaluation of program impact. And as we know, the evidence base for nutrition sensitive programs tends to be weaker than nutrition specific interventions. And even if we can show impact, then often we cannot say why. So it leaves us in the dark, and we cannot expect to be able to replicate the same impact if we don't know exactly why we've achieved it. So I would advocate strongly that in addition to looking at program impact, we need to call for formative research so that we do understand the drivers, and that can inform then the subsequent actions. But in doing that, it has to be done hand in hand with those local actors that can participate, as Gwen was saying, in the diagnosis of the problem, but also in helping find the solution. I've had a very interesting comment in from Alia. WFP would like to share some insights from their recent assessment in Somalia to contribute to the discussion. And I think this is very relevant, so I'll read it out. Vulnerability to GAM varies by livelihood system. Fluctuation of GAM rates in pastoral communities is high. Year-on-year fluctuations during drought years, which actually reflects a little bit what we saw in the graphs, possibly. Meanwhile, riverine agriculture populations experience rather small year-on-year fluctuations, but rather recurrent seasonal variation of GAM rates during lean season. This calls for differentiated analysis of vulnerabilities to GAM to understand drivers and entry points. And I think that's a very valuable comment from the experience in Somalia, which very much agrees with what Gwen was saying about the fact that we cannot assume a homogeneity between communities, and actually we will have a lot of variation. Does anybody else want to add anything on that? I have another question. Considering the paradigm shift to double, triple burden of malnutrition in most countries from the previous burden of undernutrition, how would the framework actually assist in addressing issues such as multiple forms of malnutrition? And I think I might actually put this to Bjorn, with your great experience of the application of the framework. I know that in our Drylands framework, we're speaking particularly about acute malnutrition, but as we know, the Unicef framework has a much broader application, so perhaps you could comment.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I think the experience so far is that the basic structures and principle of the concept framework, or causality framework rather, applies quite well to different forms of malnutrition, also overnutrition, because especially now as we move into a situation where virtually all foods, even in rural areas, are being purchased. Very little is actually produced in the own household. Then the sort of wealth or the cash situation at the household level really determines on what kind of foods that can be made available to the family, and especially to the vulnerable children. So in terms of the basic causes, essentially resources and support group and other things, more or less the same factors apply. But I think just as we discussed in the dryland areas, of course, the conceptual causality framework need to be adapted to those local situations, and maybe you get more emphasis on some aspects rather than others when you move into different situations, including urban areas. So I don't have a hands up, function on my on my phone, Helen. So maybe I can just say quickly a few things on the other issues here, and the fact on that first question on the apparent higher vulnerability to acute malnutrition in these kind of dryland areas, while it still normally has a better situation of chronic undernutrition. I mean, my experience primarily from Ethiopia, Niger, and especially Tanzania is very much linked to the fact that dryland area, almost you have a strong element of agropastoralism, and milk being a very essential part of all child feeding practices. So once you find yourself in a situation where milk dries up, immediately it becomes a very dramatic crisis in terms of the child feeding, and quite quickly turns into high numbers of children with acute malnutrition. And I think it's a little bit linked to the example we just saw in Somalia as well. Let me just also come back to the fact with the AAA cycle, including what you said yourself, Helen. I mean, AAA is not an add-on to the causality framework. It's actually the other way around. I would encourage everybody to go back to the UNICEF Nutrition Strategy 1990, because there the fundamental principle is the AAA cycle. And it is actually also clear that it's not a AAA cycle at some kind of program management level, which is almost self-evident. I mean, the trick is to get the families and the communities to be more capable of practicing a AAA approach themselves, so that they learn and to deal with the problems better, and they can help one another. And they, by seeing the problem better, understanding the problem better, and then being supported to take actions within their own context and within their own availability. And that leads to the issue also of community health workers. And I would also say agriculture extension workers of different forms. They are absolutely crucial in facilitating such community-based. In most of the areas in Africa, these categories of workers, they are living a very difficult situation right now. In many places, community health workers are being phased out. And so those key, and especially in marginalized areas, you hardly find any of these people. So I think as we try to intensify our efforts to find sustainable solution in more marginalized in areas, including dryland areas, we really have to take a serious look into these factors. As it is now, most of the community health workers and many of the NGOs, but emergency NGOs, as we know, they have to survive with very short-term funding windows, and to train people, organize people within 3 or 6 months framework is almost impossible. I think this kind of thing needs to be seriously discussed and addressed to move towards sustainable solution. And on that side, I fully support what I think Luka said. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. I think that's a really valuable point to end with. Not only are the community health workers and others absolutely crucial to facilitating these approaches, I think often we are not valuing what they bring, their knowledge they bring. So looking at the wider challenges of how we promote a joint or a... Anyway, I think it's time to wrap up, and I just want to thank Gwen, Bjorn, Lauren, Luka and Dominique for a great discussion, and thanks to all of you online for joining us and sharing your questions and experiences. Just to say that the webinar and the development of the brief, which is a draft, one step in a much longer process of engagement for ourselves. We know that a framework is not a panacea. On its own, it is not the answer, but it is vital to developing a better understanding, and it is part of a wider process, as Bjorn explained. I also just wanted to say that, as we heard, the discussion today is very timely with the forthcoming UNICEF strategy. And also, I think it was Dominique who recently said, building resilience is not a single agency business. And I think similarly in addressing acute malnutrition, it's neither a single agency business, but also we have to find ways for it to be driven by local, national and regional actors and initiatives. Anyway, if there are questions that we did not get to, please send them over to me or the relevant person. You can see my email address and the email addresses of the panelists on the slide. I want to thank you to all of those who've already commented on the brief. We welcome more comments, and the link to the brief is on the slide. We will share the webinar recording with you in the next couple of days. And when you leave the webinar, a very short survey will pop up. Do us a favor and take 2 minutes to fill it out. So this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all very much and goodbye.